Good afternoon. We continue our Congress, and I am glad to welcome Professor Philip Bullock, Professor of Russian Art and Music at the Oxford University. The main area of his scientific interest is Russophone art and music and culture from the late 18th century onwards. Also with special focus on world music relationship in song and opera. And also one of his interests is questions of translation, transcultural exchange more generally. And today he will present us keynote lecture entitled Seeing with the Inner Ear, Music and Image at Turn of Century. Please.
Thank you so much, Ruta. First of all, I'd like to express my very sincere thanks to the organizers of this wonderful conference for the generous invitation to deliver this lecture. It's a huge honor, and I'm also very aware that in comparison to everybody else gathered in this room, I can in no way consider myself an expert in the works of Čiurlionis. I've learned greatly from the scholarship of many people here in this room, and I've already learned a huge amount today and made some changes. I speak, however, no Lithuanian. I speak only a very small amount of Polish, and that puts me at a great disadvantage when addressing this theme. So as my title suggests, what I'm going to do is take a step back from the figure at the center of our discussion and to think of some broader case studies and reflect on different questions inspired by Čiurlionis' mastery in both music and painting. And I'm also going to be situating his legacy in the broader context of turn-of-the-century debates in European culture, both which influenced him and his creativity and to which he made such a significant contribution. But before I address some questions, I want to do what we often do in the Anglo-American world, and is express my positionality, and to take a moment to reflect on how important it feels for me to be here today in Lithuania. I began my academic study of Russian in October 1991. Much of my inspiration came from the events that were happening in places like this. Like many people, I watched with excitement and admiration as the people of Lithuania threw off decades of Soviet occupation. Moreover, what struck me as a young musician at the time was how central music was to Lithuania's search for self-determination. I'm thinking in particular of the choral singing that was such a feature of all three Baltic republics, and how this seemed then to offer a peaceful, inclusive, harmonious model of democratic participation in civic life. And how inspiring to learn that one of the figureheads of Lithuanian independence was himself a musicologist. I'm referring, of course, to Vytautas Landsbergis. I'm only sorry it's taken me nearly however many years, 34 years, to make my first pilgrimage to Vilnius. The mood of the early 1990s was, of course, one of optimism and idealism, and we live in a very different world now. And as a specialist in Russian culture, I must necessarily acknowledge the tragedy and inhumanity of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. I say that because I cannot avoid the question of Russian culture and its relationship to Čiurlionis' reputation. As a student, I studied the literature and culture of the Silver Age, and it was reading the work of Vyacheslav Ivanov that I first came across the case of Čiurlionis. And it was, of course, through the writings of Ivanov and other symbolists, not least the Lithuanian poet and translator Jurgis Baltrušaitis, that Čiurlionis' reputation first passed into wider European consciousness. The exhibitions of Čiurlionis' paintings in St. Petersburg and Moscow, the performances of his compositions in the imperial capitals, and his reception by a generation of Russian modernists remain still important documents in our understanding of his place in turn-of-the-century European culture, and we've already had several presentations today on that topic. I'm very conscious, of course, that early criticism often saw Čiurlionis as part of that Russian culture, and I'm thinking of his inclusion in the second post-impressionist exhibition that opened in London in October 1912, which included 3 of his paintings alongside works by Goncharova, Larionov, Petrov-Vodkin, Röhrich, and others. With time, of course, that Russianness has been effaced, and Čiurlionis has taken his rightful place in narratives of Lithuanian culture, not least because of the scholars, many of whom are in this room. However, it is with Ivanov's essay from 1914 that I want to begin. Drawing on the language of Russian symbolism, Ivanov argues that Čiurlionis' paintings take us from the realm of ordinary reality to a higher reality, ad realibus ad realioria. Whilst rooted in the real, or at least seemingly recognizable objects, his artistic practice transforms those objects into something symbolic, investing them with metaphysical significance. As to how this transformation is achieved, it is Ivanov's contention that it is Čiurlionis' dual vocation as both painter and musician. How and by what law does something distant and significant grow out of a familiar and trifling thing? To answer this question, it is necessary to describe Čiurlionis' method, which is personal and novel. In my opinion, his method is the artistic treatment of the elements of visual perception according to a principle derived from music. For Ivanov, Čiurlionis' art is an experimental synthesis of painting and music. And Ivanov goes on to offer a number of descriptions and interpretations of his paintings, all veiled in the heavily metaphorical language of symbolism and making parallels with ideas drawn from Goethe and from Plato. However, Ivanov seems to have known nothing of Čiurlionis' music itself, stating confidently and probably rather ignorantly, he was a musician not because of his special musical training, since he did not produce anything particularly new or important in music, but the musical element seems to fill his inner self and concentrate mainly, strange as it may seem, on the center of his visual perception. There is a reason for this, of course. In this early phase, performances of Čiurlionis' music were rare in Russian modernist circles, so his reputation as an artist working simultaneously in 2 media was more a question of belief than of first-hand experience. Indeed, the appeal of Čiurlionis' work lay primarily in the fact that it confirmed a preconceived notion of the synthesis of the arts. That was a belief that was widespread in artistic circles around the turn of the century, of course, and Ivanov's essay alludes to the examples of Wagner's theory of the Gesamtkunstwerk and to Scriabin's synesthesia. That is well known, but what is perhaps more interesting about Ivanov's essay is his equal skepticism about the possibility of ever achieving such a synthesis. Towards the beginning of his essay, he states, "No form of art should try to abandon its natural limits. No artist should consciously wish to allow his art to undergo so radical a change." He then goes on to distinguish music from painting as follows. Divorcing itself from the 4th dimension, which we usually call time, painting assumes all objects as static and incapable of movement. Motion itself, under the gaze of Gorgons, becomes petrified into a moment that will last for all eternity. The kinetic nature of music unfolds over a period of elapsed time and therefore makes us forget space. In this manner, the 2 sisters, painting, which knows only space, and music, which knows only time, oppose each other. Now, Ivanov's caveats are, I think, striking, as they suggest a position of aesthetic purism more closely associated with a high modernist thought of Clement Greenberg or Theodor Adorno. And it seems important to take Ivanov's caveat seriously, precisely because he was himself a symbolist. Now, this distinction between the temporal essence of music and the spatial essence of painting is rooted in the work of the 18th century philosopher and writer Gotthold Friedrich Lessing and in particular his 1766 treatise, The Laocoon, an essay on the limits of painting and poetry. Lessing was certainly not the first to address this question of how the various art forms might be compared, or rather distinguished. That debate reached back to antiquity and was refined over the centuries. But Lessing's text is perhaps the most influential discussion of the commensurability of the arts, or rather the lack of commensurability between them. And Lessing's influence on the 19th and early 20th centuries was considerable, as we can see from Ivanov's implicit citation in his essay on Čiurlionis. So it's with Lessing in mind that I wish to examine not so much the synthesis of the arts as the limits placed on such a synthesis, in order then to work out why the search for such a synthesis between music and painting became such a priority around the turn of the century. Lessing's argument is based on a reading of the statue of the Trojan priest and his sons being devoured by sea serpents, and which is in the collection of the Vatican museums in Rome. Lessing would have known accounts of the sculpture by Pliny and by Winckelmann, as well, of course, of Virgil's poetic description of the scene. For our purposes, the most important aspect of Lessing's argument is his discussion of how different artistic media inhabit time and space, a distinction that underpins his discussion of what he argues to be the fundamental incommensurability of the arts. So, for instance, he argues that nothing obliges the poet to concentrate his picture into a single moment. He can take up every action, if you will, from its origin and carry it through all possible changes to its issue. Every change, which would require from the painter a separate picture, costs him, the poet, but a single touch. I'll come back to Lessing later, but first I need to shift my perspective to events that took place across the 19th century and which sought to efface precisely these generic distinctions that were so central to Lessing's aesthetic paradigm. The story is a familiar one and traces the move away from representation as the primary function of art, as embodied by Horace's frequently cited dictum ut pictura poesis, cited by many 18th century thinkers, including Lessing. With that shift, a shift away from representation and relatedly a rejection of art's didactic function, there came an emphasis instead and a turn towards artistic self-sufficiency, in which the aesthetic became a cause in and of itself. Now, by contrast, art's function lay in the search for the metaphysical, the noumenal, the sublime, and the symbolic, rather than the concrete, the phenomenal, the everyday, and the real. And within this context, music came to occupy now the highest place in the hierarchy of the arts, precisely because of its association with abstraction rather than representation, as well as its perceived ability to efface the crucial distinction between form and content. And as a result, the boundaries between the artistic media themselves began to blur, in theory, if not always, in practice. So to capture that romantic aspiration, I want to turn to an essay by Walter Pater, an Oxford academic, of course, in his essay, The School of Čiurlionis, first published in 1877 and later included in editions of his Renaissance studies in art and poetry. This is, of course, the essay which contains the infamous quotation that all art constantly aspires towards the condition of music. But Pater's claim is actually rather more complicated than this suggests. As he goes on, for while in all other kinds of art it is possible to distinguish the matter from the form, and the understanding can always make this distinction, yet it is the constant effort of art to obliterate it. That the mere matter of a poem, for instance, its subject, namely, its given incidents or situation, that the mere matter of a picture, the actual circumstances of an event, the actual topography of a landscape, should be nothing without the form, the spirit of the handling, that this form, this mode of handling, should become an end in itself, should penetrate every part of the matter. That is what all art constantly strives after and achieves in different degrees. So here, in Pater, we see the legacy of Romantic thought, the move towards abstraction, towards formalism, and towards aestheticism. And in this move, it is music that most fully embodies the ideals of the Romantic age, inspiring the other arts to do just the same. Each art may be observed to pass into the condition of some other art, by what German critics term an Anderstreben, a partial alienation from its own limitations, through which the arts are able, not indeed to supply the place of each other, but reciprocally to lend each other new forces. Yet Pater's argument is, I contend, more complex and more subtle, even harboring a skepticism towards the very possibility of such an interpenetration of the arts, an Andersstreben. At several points in his essay, he refers back to Lessing, and Pater's essay begins with the following warning against any attempt to efface the formal distinctions between artistic media. It is the mistake of much popular criticism to regard poetry, music, and painting, all the various products of art, as but translations into different languages of one and the same fixed quantity of imaginative thought, supplemented by certain technical qualities of colour in painting, of sound in music, of rhythmical words in poetry. He argues fundamentally that the arts are defined by their limitations, not their similarities. And he goes on to argue something important about the role of the critic, which he defines as follows. To define these limitations, to estimate the degree in which a given work of art fulfills its responsibilities to its special materials, to note in a picture that true pictorial charm, which is neither a mere poetical thought or sentiment on the one hand, nor a mere result of communicable technical skill in colour or design on the other. To define in a poem that which is truly poetical, that true poetical quality, which is neither descriptive nor mediative merely, but comes of an inventing handling of rhythmical language, the element of song in the singing. To note in music the musical charm, that essential music, which presents no words, no matter of sentiment or thought, separable from the special form in which it is conveyed to us. I've cited this essay in some detail because, written in 1877, it sits nicely between the heyday of Romanticism and the advent of modernism, the question to which I now turn. In his study of the total work of art in European modernism, David Roberts delineates a double genealogy of the avant-garde. One genealogy goes back to French painting and the turn away from academism in the mid-19th century. The other genealogy looks back to German music, especially Wagner. So with that Franco-German distinction in mind, I want to cite one French and one German example to continue my examination of the developing tension between music and painting in the long 19th century. They will not surprise you, Baudelaire and Kandinsky. And I've chosen them because, as with Pater, they illustrate the tension between, on the one hand, a will to synthesis, and on the other hand, an acceptance of the limitations placed upon that aspiration. The Baudelaire example is, predictably enough, his sonnet Correspondance, which I have chosen because of a single word, comme, like, or as. Correspondance became a primer in the theory of the poetic symbol and a key text underpinning inter-art analogy. But like Pater's claim that all art aspires constantly towards the condition of music, Baudelaire's paradigmatic text is more complex. On the one hand, it contains a series of direct statements that assume a commensurability between object and description. In the first stanza, nature is a temple in which living pillars give voice to confused words. There, man passes through forests of symbols which look at him with understanding eyes. What we have here is a world in which an exterior material surface hides a hidden symbolic essence. It is the task of the poet to penetrate the latter and translate between the two realms. But that sense of correspondence is far more imprecise than we might think. And in the rest of the poem, Baudelaire makes extensive use of the word comme. I've highlighted it in there red. It's not very visible, for apologies. Repetition is, of course, a key symbolist practice, creating a sense of sonorous musicality that begins to dislocate language from its referential moorings and reminding us of another key feature of language, sound. But comme, like or as, carries a rhetorical weight it cannot sustain. Baudelaire dreams of a synesthetic world in which perfumes, colours, and sounds correspond. But think about it. How can scents be as cool as the flesh of children, as sweet as oboes, as green as meadows? To use the language of rhetoric and literary criticism, Baudelaire's correspondence opens with a metaphor, one thing is another, but in the rest of the poem, it evolves into the less precise comparison implied by simile, i.e. one thing is like another. This is a subtle, elusive distinction, but a crucial one. To suggest that one thing is something else is to posit an exact and identical correspondence between them. To suggest that one thing is merely like another is to suggest analogy, but not yet complete identification. It even implies, I would suggest, that something is in essence not akin to something else. Now, I realize that my interpretation of this sonnet is perhaps rather fastidious, rather unconventional, but it suits my purpose by pointing to the limitations that are inherent in any act of comparison. And it suggests too that the unity of the arts is closer to a simile than to a metaphor, and that the formal properties that distinguish each art form constitute an inherent impediment to the creation of the total work of art. So, with Baudelaire and Pater in mind, I now wish to turn to the case of Kandinsky. I'm aware of the long-standing debate about the relationship between the work of Kandinsky and Čiurlionis, and more specifically, the question of whether Čiurlionis had any impact on Kandinsky's turn to abstraction. This is not the question I propose to discuss here. Rather, my interest in Kandinsky rests on his discussion of the relationship between painting and music in his treatise Über das Geistige in der Kunst, concerning the spiritual in art. Throughout, Kandinsky draws self-consciously on the language of sound and at times of music to talk about painting. He uses words such as resonance, echo, reverberation, key, harmony. He also refers to the key word mood, although the German word Stimmung is already much more musical than in English, and it suggests the action of tuning an instrument, but also voicing human vocabulary. He cites Beethoven, Schumann, Weber, Wagner, Debussy, Mussorgsky, and Scriabin, above all Schoenberg, almost more than he cites painters, Rossetti, Burne-Jones, Böcklin, von Stuck, Segantini, and Cézanne. When he turns to literature, Kandinsky cites the case of Maeterlinck, principally because in his plays, the word is an inner sound, whose constant repetition creates a sense of musicality that is, he says, more powerful than a bell tolling, a plucked string, the clatter of wood falling on wood. So Kandinsky is advocating for a kind of contemporary aesthetic in which the various arts and disciplines learn from one another and often share common aspirations. Equally, he notes that the arts have, in recent times, never come together more closely than now in this final hour of the spiritual revolution. And he argues, too, that painting's turn towards abstraction is inspired directly by music's lack of referential content. This is why, he says, in painting we find this ongoing search for rhythm and abstract, almost mathematical construction. This explains the contemporary appreciation for repeated tones in color, for dynamism and motion within color, and so on. This leads him to argue that it is Schoenberg's emancipation of dissonance that Kandinsky sees as analogous to his own interest in abstraction. What is less familiar about Kandinsky is his debt to Lessing and his continued interest in the formal separateness of the arts. As he says, one art form must first learn from another how it exploits its resources and then learn how to apply its own media in a way that is essentially the same, but guided by the principle that is unique to each discipline alone. In learning this, the artist must not forget that every medium has its own appropriate mode of application, which awaits discovery. And then he goes on, music has the asset of time, for example, and of extended duration. While painting lacks this advantage, an artist can, however, present his audiences with the entirety of work in one moment, one glance, a luxury that music does not enjoy. As with Baudelaire and Pater, so too with Kandinsky. A search for the unity of the arts ends up reinscribing a sense of their individuality and distinctiveness. What is, though, more important, I think, than Kandinsky's theorizing is his awareness of the role of the viewer and the listener, and that's the topic that I wish to devote the rest of my talk to. Much discussion of inter-art relations focuses on intentionality, on how writers, composers, and artists themselves seek to efface distinctions between their media in the search for synthesis and the production of a total work of art. Yet what links Kandinsky, Pater, and Lessing is the fact that their ideas shift the focus towards the act of reception and perception. In his discussion of color, Kandinsky remarks that it is only when a person's sensitivities are more highly developed that the range of properties or capacities of various objects and entities acquire inner value and eventually an inner sound that can be heard by the viewer. In his preface to the Renaissance, Pater argued that to see the object as in itself it really is has been justly said to be the aim of all true criticism. But he notes that the first step to seeing one's object as it really is to know one's own impression as it really is, to discriminate it, to realize it distinctly. Fundamentally, Pater emphasizes not so much intention as reception. What is this song or picture, this engaging personality in life or in a book to me? What effect does it produce on me? Does it give me pleasure? If so, what sort or degree of pleasure? This impulse was inherent in Lessing, where the distinction between painting and poetry rests primarily on how artworks in different media are perceived. How do we obtain a clear idea of a thing in space? First, we observe its separate parts, then the union of these parts, and finally the whole. Our senses perform these operations with such amazing rapidity as to make them seem but one. This rapidity is absolutely essential to our obtaining an idea of the whole, which is nothing more than the result of the conception of the parts and of their connection. Suppose now that the poet should lead us in proper order from one part of the object to the other. Suppose he should succeed in making the connection of these parts clear to us. How much time will he have consumed? The details, which the eye takes in a glance, he enumerates one by one. And it often happens that by the time he has brought us to the last, we have forgotten the first. Yet from these details, we form a picture. When we look at an object, the various parts are present to the eye. We can run over them again and again. The ear, however, loses its details, the details it has heard, unless memory retain them. And if they have been retained, what pain and effort it costs us to recall their impressions on the proper order, and with even the moderate degree of rapidity necessary to the obtaining of a tolerable idea of the whole. And it is this sense of how the individual reader or viewer receive and process artworks that is, I think, the most significant legacy of Lessing's thought when it comes to the question of artistic synthesis and inter-art analogy. It is a legacy that fundamentally shaped Pater and Kandinsky, and which might help us when it comes to a consideration of the work of Čiurlionis. His is a singular case. Many of the leading figures in Europe and culture around the turn of the century evinced an attraction to the ideas of Baudelaire and Wagner. Scriabin's discussion of colour perception is but one example, and one, moreover, that emerged from a similar intellectual and cultural context to the one that shaped Čiurlionis himself. Kandinsky was an avid musician, and his sympathetic understanding means that his discussion of the relationship between music and painting is more than merely casual. Yet there is a fundamental disparity between his relationship to the two media. Kandinsky's expertise in painting far outstrips his facility in music. The same might be said of Schoenberg. Although he was an accomplished painter, particularly of haunting portraits, his work in visual culture was fundamentally that of a highly talented amateur. Moreover, stylistically, his paintings never achieved the same degree of radical innovation that his music did. The emancipation of dissonance in music was not accompanied by an analogous turn to abstraction in painting. We might even bring in Stravinsky here, in particular his 3 Japanese lyrics written in 1912 to 13. Like many European artists, Stravinsky was inspired by Japanese prints, and as he wrote to a friend, when he was setting these short Japanese texts in Russian, he hoped, quote, to achieve the linear perspective of Japanese declamation. Later in life, he recalled, the impression which they made on me was exactly that made by Japanese paintings and engravings. The graphic solution of problems of perspective and space shown by their art incited me to find something analogous in music. And if you look at the manuscript, very faintly there, of one of the 3 lyrics, you can see that they are one of Stravinsky's most beautifully calligraphed scores, and moreover, that he signs the tempo direction and signs it in the style of a Japanese seal. In the case of Čiurlionis, however, we are dealing with an artist who worked across both music and painting equally, although at different phases. The relationship between his work and as a composer and as a painter has been treated in detail by many scholars, and I do not even dare to summarize their ideas or even to suggest that I can add anything to their interpretations. What I want to do is to speculate not so much about the creative relationship between music and painting in his life and work, as about the impact of that relationship on the cognitive processes that determine how we, audiences, engage with his works. To ask then how we might hear his paintings and how we might see his musical compositions. The former task is more straightforward and has been the subject of a great deal of scholarship. There is, of course, the use of musical titles to describe paintings, most notably sonata, but other genres such as prelude and fugue. A widespread practice at the time, this makes one think of an artist such as Whistler and his appeal to the symphony. But when we come to the case of Čiurlionis, we move from the general metaphorical idea to something expert and experienced. His habit of linking 3 or 4 individual pictures into a single whole has the effect of imposing a kind of inherent narrativity, a temporality on these works, requiring the viewer to take them not at a single moment, but in a sequence that has acquired a strongly temporal aspect. Moreover, within individual paintings, a tendency to combine different pictorial layers obliges the viewer to move between them and produces what might be called a sense of visual counterpart, shifting the emphasis from the visual to the temporal. In both cases, a sense of sequential narrativity and internal counterpoint are the products not so much of artistic intention, but that of artistic perception on the part of a viewer who is required to participate in the production of a special kind of quasi-musicalized cognition. Long before the advent of aleatory techniques, of graphic scores, or other forms of composition in which the composer relinquished his or her control over the evolution of the musical material, Čiurlionis seems to have intuited the power of music as a way of involving the audience directly in the production of artistic sensation. Moreover, as a trained musician, he is sensitive to the question of what, in fact, music is. Much scholarship has focused on the question of music as an instance of performance, or an instance of organized sound, or, in the case of Ivanov, the expression of the absolute and the metaphorical. But music is also a form of script, akin to the action of writing words on a page or putting strokes on a canvas. The representation of the material means of musical production has a long history in art, just as it became an object of interest to many modernists. In Čiurlionis, this is not just a question of a visual language that resembles, in the way that some of Klee's paintings do, the staves of a score. It relates even to the inclusion of notation itself in visual form, as in the sequence of Lithuanian folk songs from 1909. Here we see not only the score of these songs, but an elaborate decorative framing that recalls perhaps the examples of Aubrey Beardsley. The repetitive, recursive use of circles and arabesques evokes waves, not in any literal sense, but in the sense that both light and sound are functions of waves. Unlike the sequential structure of Čiurlionis' sonatas, these ornamental works, stripped of color and of shade, presuppose a mode of cognition that is not linear, that is not instantaneous, but is instead expansive, cyclical, and rhythmic, just as music is. So what of music? Can we perform a reverse process when it comes to Čiurlionis' scores and identify a means of understanding them that draws on the cognitive processes that are inherent in visual perception? Here we need, I think, to set aside the larger orchestral canvases that have often been discussed in this context, in the forest and the sea. For obvious reasons, parallels with Debussy have been adduced here, as well as with the programmatic symphonic poems that were such a feature of both the Russian National School and the New German School. But if we turn back to Kandinsky for a moment, we will find the important warning. Program music is a good example of how dire it can be to attempt to use musical means to reproduce external natural forms. Now, Kandinsky's warning relates to the tone poems of Richard Strauss and is, I think, a reductive interpretation of the aesthetic aim of program music. But if we turn instead to the sequence of preludes, the ones that are gathered together under the title of Marios, the sea that Čiurlionis composed in the very final years of his life, we find a different relationship with the visual. Scholars have pointed to the harmonic inventiveness of these late works, with their move to a musical language bordering on the atonal. They've also singled out their propensity to linearity and quasi-polyphonic voice leading. But what interests me is their sense of compression and concision, as if the reduction that Čiurlionis is seeking here challenges the durational aspect of musical listening, creating instead an impression of instantaneity, the very impression that has been the principal characteristic of visual culture. So these are very inexpert, external, non-authoritative, preliminary suggestions about how we might undertake a reconsideration of the question of the relationship between the realms of the visual and the musical, whether in the works of Čiurlionis himself or in other figures around the turn of the 20th century. Thank you for listening to me so attentively, and once again, thank you to the organizers of this wonderful conference for the kind invitation to speak.
So thank you, Philip, for this fascinating reconsideration of such an important topic of interrelationships of arts. And we're almost out of time, so we have probably time for one question from audiences, please.
Thank you so much. So still, why do you think that Vyacheslav Ivanov denied Čiurlionis the possibility of creating Gesamtkunstwerk? I have my own idea. I think it was великорусский chauvinism.
Entirely possible. I mean, it's based, of course, on the fact that the visual works he'd seen were quite limited, and they were very often in reproduction, and that he'd had very little chance to hear any of the compositions. So, I mean, he's working out of ignorance and imposing his own idea on someone who looks as if they're going to corroborate their idea. But you may well be right that in the works of Moscow, Petersburg intellectuals is the presumption that someone not coming from their milieu and not bearing their academic training and cosmopolitanism in that sense don't count. I don't know. I will leave that question to you, Marina, and other experts when it comes to the Silver Age.
Some more questions? Yeah, please.
I wonder if I might hazard a different interpretation of the recurrence of "comme" in Baudelaire's poem. You know, less as a kind of a marker of the limits of likeness. You know, kind of as a self-defeating move of the project it is, of the symbolist project, but on the contrary, a performance of it, not in terms of some sort of mathematical equivalence, but precisely as rhythm, turning the whole thing into an invocation, an incantation. Yeah. So you perform the proximity through resonant interval, as Marshall McLuhan would put it. Yeah. And so maybe that was a symbolist discovery, that of course that Čiurlionis translated to pictorial arts.
You're completely right. I mean, I said very briefly that repetition was a key example of symbolist inter-art practice, but I was so keen to offer my deconstructive reading that I probably didn't make that clear. But what I'd like to take out of that is performance, because what I'm seeing here is works in separate fields compared and contrasted. I think when we look forward beyond this period towards performance art and inter-art and self-consciously multimedia works authored by the same persona, we've already heard Scriabin mentioned, then everything changes again. So I'm looking at artists working either in separate media, comparing them, or crossing from one to another. But what happens when someone works in 2 or 3 simultaneously is probably going back to the correspondence through performativity. Yeah, absolutely, I would agree.
Labai ačiū už atvažiavimą ir viską.
Yes, thank you very much for...
Jo, bet
Ivanovui pasakyčiau, 14 metai Šenkerio erdvėlaikio kompozicijos teorija, Urzas teorija, kuri atskleidė muzikos erdves, bent jau 3 erdvių santykį, Šenkeris. O dėl formos ir medžiagos santykio hilomorfizmas, nuo Aristotelio laikų hilomorfizmas. Taip kad tie atskyrimai tokie grubus, jie labai visada pavojingi. Kad čia vienas yra tik erdvė, kitas tik tai erdvė, o kitas tik laikas, arba čia yra vienas tik forma, kitas materija, tai ypač modernizmui labai būdingas hilomorfizmas. Tai čia net ne jum, o Ivanovui ir dar kažkam. Ačiū.
Relationship between time and space, and she just mentioned these concepts by Schenker and hilomorphism and others from the same time. But I think it's really possible to start new discussion about numerous homologies of that time. For example, relationships of senses in sciences and arts and so on. And I guess it's a very good topic for final discussions. So, and thank you very much again. Also